It always began with the hiss of steam against the cold glass. By mid-afternoon, the kitchen windows would be so clouded that the garden outside blurred into nothing more than shifting patches of winter grey. Mum stood at the stove, her hand steady on the pot lid, the wooden spoon in her other hand, worn smooth from years of stirring. When she lifted the lid from the gravy pot, the steam curled upward in lazy swirls, carrying with it the deep, rich scent of roasted beef. It was the kind of smell that seemed to coat the walls, cling to jumpers, and sink into the very grain of the table. The oven ticked as it cooled, releasing the faint crackle of roasted potatoes resting on their tray. Skins blistered and golden. On the counter sat the Yorkshire puddings, still puffed and proud from the heat, their hollow centres waiting for gravy. The radio murmured quietly from the corner. The BBC announcer's voice muffled by the hiss of the kettle, as if the whole room had agreed to keep its own rhythm. Dad stood at the head of the table, carving the beef with slow, deliberate strokes. The blade glinting briefly in the light from the single yellow bulb above. That light, slightly too dim and humming faintly, gave the room a warm, honeyed glow, as though the air itself had thickened with comfort. I'd hover nearby, pretending to be busy with the salt or the cutlery, but really watching Dad's hands. They moved with a kind of quiet skill, each slice falling neatly into a growing pile, the meat pink at the center and dark at the edges. Not too thin, he'd murmur, more to himself than anyone else, and Mum would answer with a faint smile, ladling gravy over the potatoes. The sound of it, the gentle splash against the porcelain, was almost as satisfying as the taste itself. Sometimes, Mum would glance over her shoulder to where I stood, her cheeks pink from the heat of the stove, and with a little tilt of her head she'd nod toward the table. That was my cue. I'd dart forward, lay the knives and forks in their places, making sure the handles were straight, then step back to watch the steam rise in ribbons from each dish. My stomach would ache with anticipation, but I never dared pinch anything. At least, not until Dad stepped away to fetch the mint sauce. And even then, it was only the smallest corner of a potato. By the time we all sat down, the windows had given up any hope of clearing, turning the kitchen into its own private world. Outside, the bare branches shivered in the wind, but in here it was warm, heavy with the mingling scents of beef, sage, and onions. Plates were passed, gravy was poured in generous streams, and the sound of cutlery clinking against china made a steady, comforting music. I remember watching Mum take her first bite, closing her eyes briefly, as if to seal the moment, while Dad reached for the horseradish with the easy certainty of a man who'd done this 1,000 Sundays before. There were little moments threaded through the meal that seemed ordinary then, but glow brighter in memory. The way Dad would catch Mum's eye over the table when the roast turned out just right. The way my sister would try to hide her Yorkshire pudding under her potatoes to save it for last. The way I'd glance up at the ceiling and notice that faint ring of light beneath the lampshade, as though it was holding the room together. Outside, the afternoon faded, turning the light through the misted glass a softer, bluer grey. The plates gradually emptied, and the last puddles of gravy were sopped up with bread crusts. By the time the final fork was set down, the kitchen smelled faintly different, still warm, but quieter somehow, like a song winding to its last note. Dad would lean back in his chair, rubbing his hands together, while Mum gathered the plates with a satisfied hum. It was in that gentle pause, that shift from eating to stillness, that I always felt the Sunday most sharply. The meal had ended, but the day was not yet done. The yellow light hummed on, the windows still misted, and somewhere beyond them the world kept moving without us. And as the steam began to fade from the glass, something else began to take its place. the stillness after lunch. The quiet would arrive all at once, as though someone had taken a great breath and decided to hold it. Outside, the streets lay still, each terraced row casting long, unmoving shadows across the pavement. The air seemed suspended, thin and bright, and from far away. So far you could barely tell which direction it came from. The sound of church bells drifted in, clear and unhurried. It was the kind of sound that didn't just mark time, but seemed to stretch it. The roast had been eaten, the plates washed and dried, the clink of cutlery fading into the background. Somewhere a kettle might whistle, but even that felt softened, as if wrapped in the hush of the afternoon. Curtains hung half-drawn, keeping the pale winter sun at bay, while the glow of a television flickered faintly against wallpaper patterned decades before. Antiques Roadshow had begun, its theme music drifting from one living room to the next, seeping out into the silence like tea into warm water. If you stepped outside, you could feel the absence of movement as much as the cold. The hum of a passing Mini would cut through, tires hissing on damp tarmac, and then fade, leaving nothing but the faint rustle of leaves against a drainpipe. Cats stretched themselves in patches of light, blinking slowly, their tails curling lazily in the still air. Even the birds seemed quieter, perching on TV aerials as though they, too, were listening to the distant bells. There was a sense, in those hours after lunch, that the world had drawn inward. Behind each door, families settled into their own small rituals. A mother might settle into the corner of the sofa with a knitting project. A father might lean back, eyes closed, hands folded over a satisfied stomach, the scent of Sunday roast still lingering in the house. Children lay on rugs, stomachs pressed into the thick pile, drawing with crayons or absently turning the pages of a comic. The stillness carried its own kind of intimacy. You could hear things you never noticed at other times. The faint creak of floorboards expanding in the heat, the distant ticking of a clock in the hallway, the whisper of a neighbor's radio to houses down. Even the smallest sounds felt magnified, as though they had to travel further to find you. And yet, beneath all this calm, there was the faintest thread of restlessness. The day was not yet over, and sooner or later the peace would give way to movement again. Shadows would lengthen, the bells would fall silent, and front doors would open to let in the cold once more. Because just inside those doors, lined up like quiet sentinels, another story waited to begin. The coats by the door, they hung there like patient witnesses to the day, each one carrying the weight of its own small history. The hallway was narrow, dim except for the pale slice of light that crept in from the frosted glass panel in the front door. Against the wall, the wooden pegs bent slightly under the weight of heavy wool coats, navy, brown, the occasional deep green, their shoulders dusted with the faintest trace of lint. The air around them was different from the rest of the house, cooler and edged with the scent of the outside world. When you passed by, you could catch it, a mingling of damp wool, rainwater clinging to seams, and the smoky trace of a neighbor's chimney that had settled into the fabric during the morning walk to church. Sometimes there was even the faint tang of polish from the wooden banister, mingling with the musty sweetness of old leather gloves tucked into coat pockets. Each coat told you something if you paid attention. Dad's was heavy and dark, with deep pockets where his hands would disappear entirely. The lining frayed near the hem from years of brushing against the church pews. Mum's was softer, shorter, the faint scent of lavender sachets clinging stubbornly to the collar despite the rain. There was my own, smaller, with buttons that always seemed too big for my fingers, and a scarf wound once around the hanger, still holding the warmth from earlier. When the wind rattled the letterbox, the coats would sway almost imperceptibly. their hems brushing against one another like old friends leaning in to share a secret. Sometimes, when no one was looking, I would bury my face into the folds of Dad's coat, breathing in that cold, rain-slicked scent, and imagine the morning all over again. The wet cobbles underfoot, the church door groaning open, the echo of hymns that seemed to follow us home. The hallway itself seemed to take on the coat's quiet presence. Footsteps softened, here voices instinctively lowered, as though this narrow space was some kind of pause between worlds. The lively warmth of the living room on one side and the bracing air of the outside just beyond the door. Each time the door opened, the coats would stir, their fibers catching the draught, offering up a renewed breath of rain and wood smoke. They were more than garments. They were keepers of the day's texture. They absorbed the weather, the scent of places, the faint brush of passing strangers. And in the stillness after lunch, they waited, uncomplaining, for the next outing. Maybe later, maybe not until next Sunday. Yet, in those brief moments when I walked past and glanced at the coats, there was always a quiet awareness that the day was winding toward evening. And evening had its own rituals, its own markers. One of them waited just around the corner, swaying gently in the shop window, the small, swinging sign that read, "Closed." It was always there, that little cardboard sign, hanging by a fraying string in the shop's dusty front window. The letters were bold once, but over the years the red had dulled to a kind of sleepy pink, the edges of each letter smudged by time and sunlight. By the time Sunday lunch had been cleared away, the sign would be turned over with a quiet flip, closed facing the street. No fuss, no hurry, just a small ritual marking the shift from the morning bustle to the stillness of the afternoon. Behind it, the shop sat dim, as though even the sweets were resting. Jars lined the shelves in neat rows, pear drops, barley sugars, striped humbugs, their glass catching what little light managed to slip between the lace curtains. A thin film of dust clung to the corners of the window, so that when you pressed your face to the glass, the world outside seemed to blur and fade at the edges. Children still came, of course, their pockets warm with a few saved coins, eyes bright with the hope that maybe, just this once, the shopkeeper might open the door again. They'd stand on tiptoe to peer inside, noses almost touching the cold glass, looking past their own reflections toward the treasure within. But the door stayed locked, the little bell above it silent, and the sign swayed gently when the wind passed down the street. The shop itself carried a smell that seemed to seep right through the walls, sweet and sharp, like the first bite of a lemon drop. Even when it was closed, you could catch it if you stood close enough, mingling with the faint, dry scent of brown paper bags stacked behind the counter. On Mondays, the bell would jingle brightly again, and life would return to those shelves. But on Sundays, the shop became something different. Not just a place you couldn't enter, but a place that seemed to belong entirely to your imagination. Standing there, you could almost picture the sweets rearranging themselves in the quiet, jars whispering to one another in soft rattles of sugar against glass. You could imagine the shopkeeper at home, the kettle whistling, slippers shuffling across a worn rug. You could hear the rest of the street too, not in shouts or clatter, but in the gentlest of ways. Because, while the jars waited in silence, somewhere nearby, a radio was murmuring through the afternoon, its voice rising and falling between soft bursts of crackle. It was never loud, the wireless. It sat tucked on a side table in the lounge, its polished wooden casing warm to the touch, its fabric speaker grill faintly dimpled with age. From it came a constant, gentle hiss, like the sound of rain falling somewhere far away, threaded through with the clipped, careful tones of the BBC. Voices rose and dipped with a kind of steady politeness, carrying news of places we had never seen, and events that seemed to move at a slower, more deliberate pace than the rest of the world. The lounge was bathed in that muted Sunday light that made everything seem softer, the edges of furniture losing their sharpness. The curtains were half drawn, letting in a slant of pale gold that lay across the carpet like a warm blanket. In the armchair by the fireplace, Dad sat with one leg crossed over the other, a newspaper folded neatly in his lap. Mum was opposite, her knitting needles clicking quietly in counterpoint to the low hum of the radio, the soft rhythm of wool sliding through her fingers. The ticking clock on the mantelpiece kept time for everyone. Each second a small, reassuring tap against the silence between words. Every so often, the announcer's voice would fade, and a swell of orchestral music would fill the room, clear and warm, before slipping back into the familiar hiss. If you listened closely, you could hear the faint crackle of the signal shifting, like the sound of a match being struck in another room. We would sit together in this slow-moving world, the air faintly scented with furniture polish and the ghost of the afternoon roast. The carpet under my hands was thick and slightly scratchy, and I traced the patterns in it absent-mindedly, while the voices from the radio painted pictures of faraway towns, troop parades, or the week's weather forecast. Every so often, Mum would glance up from her knitting, meeting Dad's eyes for a brief moment, sharing something unspoken but understood. It was a kind of stillness that didn't demand silence. It welcomed the small sounds, the turning of a newspaper page, the gentle cough from the fireplace as the last embers shifted, the faint clink of Mum's teacup meeting its saucer. Even the wireless itself seemed part of the family in those moments, its quiet presence filling the gaps between us without ever asking for attention. Outside, the light would begin to thin, the golden slant across the carpet shrinking toward the skirting board. The announcer's voice might remind listeners of the time, as if the whole country was taking note together. And for a moment the room felt linked to every other lounge in Britain, where the same voice hummed through the air. And when the last of the daylight slipped away, the wireless would click off with a small, satisfied sigh, leaving only the ticking clock and the soft settling of the house. But in the stillness that followed, a different sound would soon take over. The rustle and shuffle of coats being lifted from their pegs, ready for the evening's walk.